And so I think we're very fortunate to have Dr. Han speak to us today, having the aspects of violence and the world as it looks from the other side. Dr. Han.
Mr. Chairman, ladies, thank you very much indeed. You don't know how happy I feel to be with you. I really do. Ever since arriving in America this time on February 7th, I have met many people because I was at the Chicago conference on China. But this is the best because I feel that it's perhaps the most important meeting of my short stay this time. I've always had great faith in women, being a woman myself, and an emancipated Asian woman. Now, the difference between an emancipated Asian woman and all other women is that we haven't got over our firm belief that we are infinitely superior to any other manifestation of life. We don't tell our men so. We leave them in the happy illusion that they are superior, so they go away happy. But we really know that it is we who can make and unmake public opinion and rule the world. And sometimes it strikes me that my Western sisters are not as full of confidence in themselves as we are. But I today have to change my opinion because of you. And because you are all leaders, you are all opinion makers, you all have so much to do to guide and to teach and educate your own kind in America. And actually, you are playing perhaps the most important role in history today. Because if we are going to have a better world, and we are, it must begin with the people asserting their own opinion and their own reason and rationality against the irrational, the corrupt, all the forces of evil, sometimes disguised under moralistic hypocrisies, which we have to fight, or otherwise humanity will be destroyed. And so today I thought I would begin by telling you, perhaps in a very broad way, something of the Asian views of this particular problem of violence among nations, because it has affected us so much. You see, we have had so much violence to live through, so much more than you do. And also because our views of history, as Mrs. Chairman said, is quite different from yours, since our experience is different. But first I must begin with the American Revolution, because that was the father and mother of all revolutions. You don't know it, but it is you who started every revolution in the world. And yet today, somehow, you don't think so. But it's you, the evildoers. It is. You started off in 1776, and today you honor the great man George Washington, who started you on that course, which set afire many other revolutions in the world. You were the first war of national liberation. And today, when I hear certain statesmen decrying wars of national liberation, my mind, as that of so many Asians, goes back to your Declaration of Independence, because we were taught American history in school, as well as Chinese history. And we were taught that this was the prototype of all the wars against colonialism was the American Revolution. And George Washington was an eminent anti-colonialist. So you see what you are responsible for. You started it all. And not only did you do that, but you trained many, many French revolutionists. In fact, you did a lot of sabotage work in Europe. You trained the French revolutionists, and they went back and made the French Revolution in 1789, another responsibility of yours. And after that, all through the 19th century, Europe went through many revolutions, which you may have forgotten, but which the people in Europe have not forgotten, in which the national modern state in its modern form emerged in Europe. And so, your revolution and the French Revolution were the prototypes of two kinds of struggle in which violence is used. One is the struggle against an outside domination, an outside force, which is yours. You had this struggle, you had this conflict, and you solved it by violence. And the second is the French Revolution, which was not primarily a struggle against an outside oppressor, but a real revolution in that it was a civil war with the overthrow of the old economic system, which was the feudal system, the system of an agricultural serfdom, overthrowing the landlords and the upper class, and finally, after many ups and downs, evolving the modern French state. And though you may not believe it, but very roughly, these two types of revolution are the prototypes of what is going on today, not in Europe, not in America, since you have had it, but in Asia. And unless you can see it in that perspective, you will never understand what is going on in Asia. But you must see it that way, because that is the way to see it. History moves slowly, but it moves irrevocably. And as it moves, it shifts. As the earth changes, it goes on from one country to another. And there is no need to evoke a conspiracy of one kind or another for the upheavals to come. They come because they must, just as yours did, just as it did in France. Today the focus has shifted to Asia, to Africa, perhaps to other regions of the world tomorrow. And revolution, the profile of future revolutions, is already there for us to see. Today in Asia, the revolution of China is already old, 17 years old, already well established in 17 years. To us, it's already past. It's already a stable state on the way to conservatism. Whereas other revolutions, but you don't think so, I know, but we in Asia think so. Because already we see other revolutions coming up. Tomorrow, in 2 years, in 10 years, in 20, there will be a terrible revolution in India. Certainly. There will be. There must be. And there is at the moment the beginning of a revolution in Indonesia. And so today I must give you a bird's eye view of all this, so that you understand accurately the problem of violence as we see it in Asia. And why it is that although we deprecate violence, in some ways, we are not able to accept entirely that things cannot be done without violence, not because of us, but because the circumstances in the world today make it nearly impossible not to have violence to some degree. And therefore, our problem is to limit it as much as possible, if possible, to do without it. But when the very stake of self-defense is involved, then the use of violence in some ways must be accepted. And it is this profound problem, which is a philosophical problem, which I am ready to discuss with you when we get to it today. I have said already that we have to accept change. And this is also a fundamental part of history. We must accept that history changes, just as we accept a child grows up. And therefore, the most tremendous fallacy, the greatest error that any state can commit is to commit itself to the statu quo, or to the maintenance of a statu quo anywhere in the world, without first being absolutely sure what they mean by the statu quo, and whether the forces that are backed are really the ones that are truly representative of this period of history. And when we come to seeing it that way, then we see that the application of violence in what is called the maintenance of peace becomes exactly the reverse. Because it becomes, by this moralistic hypocrisy, only another way of exhibiting violence. And this is what happens very often in Asia today. When you did your revolution, there was no interference. Even when you had your civil war, when you were divided into North and South Vietnam, and President Abraham Lincoln wanted to unite your country, nobody interfered. Nobody interfered because the means of communication at that time were quite different from what they are today. But today, anything that happens on the globe is susceptible of intervention and interference in the name of protection of peace, which means only the application of violence without having sufficiently considered whether this application of violence in the name of peace for the maintenance of the statu quo is really good for the people of that country or that region, or whether you are only backing old and corrupt forces which are already on the downgrade. And this is particularly true, as you well know, at the moment in Asia. Because in Asia, we are now undergoing what you underwent 200 years ago. We are only out of colonialism. And let me then briefly go back over the last 40 years and remind you that the world in 1925, 40 years ago, was very different from what it is now. In 1925, India, the whole of India, now an independent state, was a British colony. There was no Pakistan. Pakistan and India were one. The whole of Indochina was a French colony. There was no North or South Vietnam, there was Indochina. And it also occupied Cambodia and Laos. The whole of Indonesia was a Dutch colony. There was no Indonesia, it was called the Netherlands East Indies. And what about China? Well, China was a hypo-colony. It was, in some ways, too tough to be cut up. But it was the subject of many spheres of influence. The Japanese had one sphere of influence, the Russians had another, the British had another, the French had another. And so, under the ostensible guise of still being independent, which was really a fallacy, it was cut up also, as Africa was, although not so clearly. The whole of Africa was divided between the Western powers. That was 40 years ago. 40 years is a very short time in history. And what have we seen? We have seen in 1945, after the Second World War, many of these countries emerging from this dependent colonial status into what is called independence. Some did it by fighting, some did it without fighting, or so it looks. But let us analyze a little bit and see whether it is true that there was no fighting. Let us take, for instance, India. Now, it is one of the great fallacies of history to represent the Indian struggle for independence as non-violent. I have gone into this question quite carefully, and I have found that the amount of violence expended in India in their war of independence goes back 100 years and probably cost 40 million lives. It started in 1857, the struggle for independence in India, 100 over years ago. And it started with very bloody riots against the British, which were suppressed and put down. And all through this time, there have been struggles in India for independence, struggles for the recovery of their sovereignty and national rights. And Gandhi emerged out of this and preached the non-violent method. But was it really non-violent? It was non-violent in this way, that there were no weapons for the masses, for the people who struggled. And the reason why there were no weapons available to them was because India was under British domination and the British had control of all the seaports and you could not smuggle weapons in. They also had very stringent laws against weapon carriers. Therefore, they had complete control of the introduction of arms to the population of India. Whereas, for instance, in your country, you can order a revolver by mail, which makes actually the situation in America to the point that every man can be armed, and therefore every man is potentially a violent unit. The same could not be true in India because there were no arms available. If there were very few, they were not used. And Gandhi realized very shrewdly that this was the situation in India, and he also realized that he had in his hands a great weapon, which was the weapon of non-violent mass action. You can only do that when you have at your disposal millions and millions of people who can all together mass solidly, go on strike solidly, do things in a big body. And he utilized that weapon, which was a very clever way of doing it. He did these great salt marches to the sea. He proclaimed hunger strikes. They sat down and stopped the railways from running by just lying down on the rails. And this was a very effective weapon. It was very effective because it was the thing that was available. But to say there was no violence is untrue, because violence was used in the name of law and order and peace by the opposite side, by the British. There were innumerable shootings. There were beatings up, lathi charges, putting in jails, and so on and so forth. So that there was violence used against the Indians. Nevertheless, in 1946, after the Second World War, India did gain her independence. And she gained it not without bloodshed, and not in a non-violent way, because there was the partition. And the partition was really the prototype of what we see everywhere today and what we in Asia resent so much: the division of every country into two, so that there will always be struggle and fighting between the two components of a single country. And we consider in Asia, perhaps we are biased that way, but we consider that this is a dark plot of the West to keep us divided. You will forgive me if I tell you this. I am telling you the truth. And so, you see, India and Pakistan were created and divided. And they are really parts of the same thing. And all people who have the welfare of India and Pakistan at heart want them to get together again. In fact, you come to the ridiculous situation where you have a general of the Pakistan army who is the brother of a general in the Indian army, and they are both fighting against each other in this border dispute. But this happens at the present moment. And sometimes they phone each other and they say, "Isn't this terrible? Isn't that so?" Something like that. And yet you have families divided, and this partition was a very bloody thing. It cost 1 million lives. 1 million lives. So that we cannot say that this was done without violence. Now we come to Indonesia. How did Indonesia gain her independence? Well, also at the conclusion of the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, while the Western powers were fighting each other, their hold, their grip on Asia was considerably weakened. And therefore, the forces for nationalism, the forces for national liberation in Asia rose at that moment. And so after the Second World War, they wanted to assert themselves. And then we come to the League of Nations, which again in our Asian eyes does not perhaps carry the prestige that it carries in other parts of the world, and for this reason, because it cheated us from the beginning. The League of Nations Charter, as you know, promised that there would be no more colonies. It promised that every country of Asia, Africa, and so on would have self-determination. But did this happen, my friends? No, it did not. As soon as the Second World War was over, the British went back to reoccupy Malaya. The French went back to reoccupy Indochina, and the Dutch were back, carried by British ships, to reoccupy Indonesia. So that if we consider sometimes the United Nations not as valuable as you do, it's not because we don't want to consider them valuable. We would very much like to. But because within a year of the proclamation of the Charter of the United Nations, we found that the deeds were not equal to the words that had been said, since the whole of Southeast Asia was once again to be colonized. And so the war in Indonesia went on. Indonesia did not get her independence without violence. Indonesia fought the Dutch, and they fought for a long time. They fought right down till 1958, only 7 years ago. In 1958, there were still rebellions fomented by Dutch and also, I'm sorry to say, by certain zealous members of the Central Intelligence Agency who were in league with the Dutch in order to overturn the rule of Indonesia. So that, to us in Asia, the whole thing appears different because our history is different. Independence, which meant, like your War of National Liberation of 1776, throwing away, throwing up the rule of the colonial exploiter, was not achieved without violence. And the second stage, which also you went through, reunification of the country through civil war, this also, we do not see how it can be done without some violence. We would like it very much to be done without violence. If somebody could indicate to us a way of doing it, of making the necessary reforms in the economic system, of lifting the people out of their tremendous poverty, of lifting them out of the age of feudalism, in which so much of Asia still remains, into the modern age without violence, we would certainly be very happy. But how can this be done? And this is our problem. Because, as I said before, in India tomorrow, there is not only the question of independence, political independence, but there is the question of going through the tremendous economic and social changes which are going to make the Indian peasant, and that is 85% of the population, not hungry, literate, with a public health system, with something like protection from the constant danger of hunger, from the constant famines, from the things which we saw in China yesterday and which today are disappearing in China. And this is also in Indonesia the problem. Very often the problem is put to you in political terms, communism versus anti-communism. And I submit that this way of looking at the problem is really like saying, give an aspirin to treat leprosy. It's about just as apposite. Because, you see, the real problem, the real concrete problem, is not communism versus anti-communism, but what is the economic system? What is the kind of social economic change which is going in the shortest possible time to raise the greatest number of these people to something like the dignity and the standard of living which we can call human instead of subhuman. It's just as simple as that, and yet I find that it is this question which nobody ever wants to talk about. People talk about communism as if it was an enormous conspiracy, as if every man, woman among us who would read a tract by Mao Zedong would immediately become communist. I submit this is quite wrong. But it is quite different for the hungry peasant. There is the peasant groveling on his little half acre. He is in debt to the usurer. He is in debt to his landlord, and the landlord is often the usurer. There are 6 of his family and himself, 4 or 5 children, his wife, maybe an old grandfather or grandmother and himself, living on a very small plot of land. He has no capital. He cannot improve himself. His tools are primitive. They go back 1,000 years. He is, as I said before, in so much debt to the usurer that even if he works all his life, he cannot clear his debt, and his sons and his sons' sons have nothing to look forward except to sell their labor to the same usurer to clear the debt, which can never be cleared because the percentage of that the usurer imposes on his loans is 36 to 72% a year, and nobody cares. He had to pay 50 to 60% of his crop as land rent to the landlord. And in these countries, and that is India, and that is Vietnam, South Vietnam, where this is happening, nothing is done. The first step which should be done in order to cure this is land reform. It means taking the land and distributing it adequately among the peasants. It means plowing the capital, whatever capital there is, among the peasantry, which is 80% of the population. It means, therefore, organizing the peasant into collectives, because when you have no capital, how are you ever going to have private individual land ownership when nobody has a cent among them to spare? The only way you can really achieve something is by having a collective system in which people pool their efforts together, and where manpower, man labor becomes the only capital you have, in order to be able then to achieve a certain modicum of security by all working together. This is the only way. And really, it surprises me that so many people in America cannot accept the idea, when your Puritan communities, when they settled in America, did exactly that. And you still have, for instance, in Wisconsin and Iowa, German communities like the Amana wool community and so on, who live on the same kind of commune system as in China today. So that, you see, this is not a very important political conspiracy. This is simple standard of living. This is a simple way of solving an economic problem. And unless you solve this problem, unless you solve it for the peasant, which is 80% of the population, you will have revolution. And there is no possibility of avoiding it. And that is why I submit to you that in spite of everything, I think we must make up our minds that we shall see many more upheavals in Asia, many more in Indonesia, in India, and also that the question of South Vietnam has been badly posed to you. It has been posed as a communist conspiracy, when really, so far as I know, the main problem in South Vietnam is, as everywhere else, the problem of the peasantry. And when the peasantry problem has not been solved, then I don't think that it is very reasonable to assume that throwing 1 ton of bombs per peasant or child, man or woman, or so-called Viet Cong killed is really going to do anything to the fundamental problem, which is the land problem. We have studied, some of us, an American in Singapore, an American lecturer, myself, and a few others, we have studied the land problem in South Vietnam. Now, we were told that there had been land reform in South Vietnam, and that this land reform had been instituted in 1955-56 by President Ngo Dinh Diem and by his brother, the Archbishop of Hue. So this young American and another person went to South Vietnam to investigate this land reform. And they did find that actually it was quite true that 300,000 acres of land near Hue had been taken over. They had been taken over by the Archbishop of Hue, who was now an enormous and very rich landlord, and who had these 300,000 acres and who did redistribute them, but only to the Catholic peasants of Vietnam that were his kind of parish, and dispossessed, in fact, many of the Buddhist peasants and others from that place. Elsewhere in South Vietnam, the problem of land reform was not tackled. And therefore, you have in South Vietnam, as you have in India, as you had in China before the revolution, the problem of this upper class, which is made of landlords, a very small upper class, which is landowning, which possesses a lot of the money, of the capital of the country, and which will not let go of its privileges, because the one thing it fears is land reform. If Ngo Dinh Diem, President Ngo Dinh Diem, while he held power in South Vietnam, had accomplished the reforms that he should have accomplished, in other words, if he had energetically tackled this problem of land reform to begin with among the peasantry, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But this was never done. It was not done between 1955 and 1961, and now it does not seem to me that in 1966 it is going to be done. And I submit to you that before we really, later on, in other circumstances, before your country or any other country that is interested in the welfare of the world take up any such problems, it is quite necessary that the real causes of the discontent, of the frustration, of the economic poverty should be tackled in all these states before doing any action, and especially armed action, which can only increase the violence instead of decreasing it. That is our problem now all over Asia. Tomorrow, it will not be South Vietnam, it will be another country, say Indonesia, or say India, where already revolt is brewing. Already there are hunger riots in the cities. Women carrying their babies on their backs raid the food hoarders in the cities of India. They are also doing so in Indonesia. At which point, at which moment do these forces, the deprived, the underprivileged, mass together and make a revolution? And at which point are they then stopped in the name of peace in the name of law and order? And does not then this attempt to stop the evolution of a situation become, on the contrary, violence on its own and misplaced violence? This is the question which I think we should ponder very deeply, especially where Asia is concerned. And now I will speak to you about China. Because as a friend, an American friend, said to me yesterday, after all, looking over the map of Asia, the only country today where the people are relatively well fed is China. Well, this was not true 15 years ago. As you know, 15 years ago, China was one of the countries where people really died of hunger. Every 2-3 years, there was either famine or flood, and anything from 1 million to 2 million people died. And there were beggars in every street. In China, the revolution dragged for a long time. It did not come all of a sudden, and I think that it is pretty well known now that it did not come as a conspiracy from outside. The Chinese revolution actually started also in the last century, the 19th century, just as did the Indian Revolution. And it started in the middle of the century and was put down, and then it started again and was put down, because that is the course of history, up and down, all the time. And a revolution is not made in a day. It takes 10, 50 years to accomplish it. And so it was with the Chinese Revolution. And this is where now we have a very interesting corollary. Many people look upon the Chinese Revolution, being the communist revolution, as they put it, as a great danger. But if you analyze very carefully what has happened, you find that the Chinese Revolution in many aspects is very much like the revolution in France in 1789, in that it is mainly composed of peasantry rising up in order to be able to assert themselves in the position of power, as they did in France. But the outcome is different. No revolution is like any other. In China, the revolution which had happened and which is called the Communist Revolution also had another component in it. It had a component, besides the political one, of an industrial revolution. And this is where we must also see very clearly that the revolutions of Asia are double. In other words, each revolution in Asia is not only a political revolution, but it's also social economic, and it is in the social economic, I mean primarily industrial revolution. And there again, you see, there is a great deal of misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is due to the fact that you had your industrial revolution 200 years ago, and we are only having it now. Now, what do I mean by industrial revolution? Well, what we think of is machinery. And the most important thing for us in Asia is electrification of the countryside, mechanization of agriculture. This appears to you to be something perhaps obvious. You have in America today machines to do your work in the countryside. You have electricity almost everywhere. People take it for granted. But we look upon this as a kind of a chief aim of the revolution that is going on. Why? Because, as I said before, most of our countries, and that applies to India, to China, and to Vietnam, and to Indonesia, have got 80% of our people tied to the land, working it because their tools are so primitive and because they haven't got power. But if we can give them power, electric power, in the form of electric pumps, if we can give them better machinery, then we can release a lot more of them for industrial projects. We won't have 80% tied to the land. We'll have only, say, 40% or 60%, which releases much more of your population to become workers in the factories. And thus, slowly, painfully, step by step, the industrial revolution will be achieved in Asia. But until we do that, and unless we do it, in other words, unless we have an agricultural revolution first, unless we mechanize and electrify the countryside first, we won't be able to have a proper, healthy industrial state. And therefore, some of the industries that you see when you travel to Asia in the big cities are fakes. They have no solid basis. They rest upon a substratum of poverty, 80% poverty. And it is this 80% of poverty, the peasantry, that is going to rise. I hope I've made this clear. Now, this is the great problem in Asia. And this is also the motive force of all our revolutions. And in this way, they have a character of their own. And this character, very often, as I said before, is not understood in the West and is often even not looked at. And it is in this that the Chinese Revolution has been successful. It has been successful in that it has seen this problem correctly. That is the problem of the peasant, the problem of the countryside. It's not a question of merely the rising in the cities of a few workers to take over factories and all that. That's nonsense, because it won't lead you anywhere. But it is the rising of the countryside peasants in order to be able to collectivize their land and from there on modernize, mechanize, and electrify the countryside. And of course, this includes in it the accumulation of capital, and from this capital, the building of schools. It includes public health projects. It includes all the things which make modern life possible at last for the peasant of Asia. And that is, and I cannot repeat it often enough, 80% of the population. Because China has seen this problem, and because she has worked on it now for 17 years, and because she has achieved quite a degree of success, not 100%, but quite a degree of success at it, many of the other Asian countries are studying the Chinese pattern. And that has absolutely nothing to do with politics. You will find many Indians who can't stand communism. They are very anti-communist. But they will go to the communes and they will say, now, we wish we could do this in India. It has absolutely nothing to do with politics for this reason, that our problems are primary and pressing. And we feel that it's an absolute waste of time to talk in words when we have such vast problems as hunger, as millions of people dying of hunger on the land. It's no use to them talking of freedom of speech. They haven't even got the freedom to eat. What are they going to talk of freedom of speech about? And to preach to these people about democracy when, well, they don't see many manifestations of it, because all they see is that they have to pay 60% of their crop still to the landlord as rent, and 36 to 72% of their money still to the usurer in order to clear the interest on the capital, and they'll never be able to repay the capital. Well, to these people to say, but that this is freedom, this is the way to be freedom, is only to excite violence. And then to come to the help of such a corrupt and decaying order. What does it mean to the peasant? It means coming to the help of the usurer who oppresses him, of the landlord who oppresses him. It doesn't mean anything else. And so I feel, and today I have finished, that when we study violence and when we study the use and application of violence, we must also not forget to include this. We must also remember that very often the application of violence in disguised form to the maintenance of the statu quo, to the maintenance of what is called peace and law and order, may be only the trigger point for infinitely more violence. And that interference in situations which we do not understand, which we have not carefully assessed, in fact, of which we know nothing because we haven't read enough history, is sometimes far more dangerous than to do nothing at all. And especially for women like yourselves, women of America, the greatest power on earth, the most powerful, and the best intentioned, it is indeed important that you should make yourselves thoroughly acquainted with what you are getting into. After all, this is not only a question of one generation. This era of revolutions is only starting for us in Asia. We surmise that it will go on for 50 to 100 years. And so if you are always going to back the wrong horse for another 50 or 100 years, well, I'm very sorry, but we are not going to solve the problem of violence. If, on the other hand, you feel that really something should be done to attack the root cause of violence, and the root cause of violence is hunger and frustration and poverty and misery, then I think the women of America can do something very great. I was just reading some statistics the other day, and these statistics gave the amount of money which is being used in order to maintain peace and order by violent means. And I'm sorry. And other. $1 billion for the whole of Southeast Asia has been promised as economic aid, of which the United States will foot $220,000. The Mekong project was first mooted in 1946, 20 years ago. The Mekong project, which you heard about last year, was first talked of 20 years ago, but nothing was done. It was again revived in 1965, last year, but is now considered stillborn. The total United States grants for all of Asia, among 11 countries of Asia, Pakistan, Nepal, Formosa, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Laos, and Philippines, among them is $700 million, which amounts to about roughly $2 US per head of population per year. But there is a minimum of $14 billion was spent in 1965 in Vietnam, $14 billion, i.e. 20 times as much. This year, 2.5 billion will be spent for the entire world as aid, and a minimum, again, of $14 billion for Vietnam. The figures, I think, should be reversed. If we really want an end to violence, we must realize that one of the means of it is to finance those things which will really go to the root of the causes of, change in a violent way. And now one last word, and that is about China again. It is very often said that China preaches violence, that China has written statements, and that recently a statement has come out saying that China advocates violence. I think that is misreading slightly what China has said. What China has said is this: we have studied the whole of this history, the same as I have today told you. And we have found that nothing has been done without violence. And we do not believe that revolutions can be done without violence, because we do not believe that the policies of the West have changed, because the West has not learned from history. This is what China means. They do not say you cannot do it without violence, but they say nobody has tried so far, and we don't think they will try. Now, what is happening in Vietnam is proving the Chinese right. In other words, I am always very amazed at the fact that the very thing that is proving the Chinese thesis that so far all revolutions and all changes in history have been violent, that this very thesis is not being disproved, but is being actually proved by the United States of America. The only way to disprove it is to reverse completely the situation by voting $60 billion US for economic aid to the world, and maybe $2 billion for armament instead of the other way around. Thank you very much.